Hello, my name's Jeff Cooper. I'm the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust's Heritage Programme Manager. I'm also a conservation carpenter, and I've now completed 5 seasons working in Antarctica as a conservation carpenter, 2 with the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust, working on the historic huts in the Ross Sea region, and 3 seasons with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, working on the historic huts on the Antarctic Peninsula. I've also spent the last 3 years working as the Heritage Programme Manager for the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and today I'd like to talk to you about our work conserving Norwich's Antarctic heritage. In 1943, at the height of the Second World War, the British government initiated a naval operation called Operation Tabarin. This aimed at establishing manned bases to prevent enemy shipping from using known anchorages in the region. Having manned bases also have the benefit of establishing a British presence and a claim over the region to counter those claims of Argentina and Chile. After the war, the operations responsibility moved from the Admiralty to the Colonial Office and was renamed as the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey, often shortened to FIDS. This organisation ran through till 1962, when the British Antarctic Survey, or BAS, was established, which runs to this day. During this time, these 3 organisations established over 30 bases in the region. Many of these were prefabricated by Boulton & Paul in their Norwich workshops. So Boulton & Paul was sending buildings to the 4 corners of the British Empire and also to the bottom of the world in Antarctica. Each of the bases were literally flying the flag for Britain. Each base had a flagpole and they all flew the Union flag whilst they were occupied. In addition to this, they also placed these wooden boards with British Crown land painted on them in prominent positions, again countering the claims of Argentina and Chile, who painted their flags on numerous structures in the area. An additional way that Britain could state and demonstrate its occupation and administration over the region was to establish post offices, and here in the bottom left we have the post office sign outside Port Lockroy. This post office is still in operation today. In the summer, the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust man a post office from within the same building that the post office was run originally, and here we receive somewhere in excess of 18,000 visitors each year, and we handle and process approximately 80,000 postcards. From the very beginning in 1944, when the bases were established, science was a major component of the operation of the bases. They studied a wide range of fields, from meteorology and atmospheric studies, glaciology, geology, zoology, botany, to name but a few. Additionally, a main function of the bases was to continue the mapping of the region, which was sparse at best. There was extensive use of dog sledges and long dog sledge journeys, during which the teams used to map the coastlines and the mountains, filling in the map as they went. Back in 1943, at the start of Operation Tabarin, Lieutenant Commander James Marr was appointed as the leader of the expedition. He was also known as Scout Marr, having first sailed south with Shackleton on the Quest expedition in 1921. His first task was to find and obtain the supplies and necessary stores for the expedition. These were obtained from naval stores, not surprisingly. Included within this was one timber frame building supplied by Boulton & Paul. This was a relatively small hut, being 16 feet by 29 feet, and was one large room with a porch. The porch was converted to being the kitchen, and the one large room was used as science spaces and also the workshops. Extensions were needed to this hut to provide the sleeping accommodation and the generator shed. These were obtained from materials, or constructed from materials obtained from Deception Island and on the neighbouring islands where there was an abandoned whaling pan. The top photograph and the centre bottom photograph were taken in February 1944 when the base was being constructed. The single room Bolton and Paul building can be seen in the foreground on the left hand photograph, and again on the right hand side with the darker roof. Also on this slide is an extract from Marr's report for the end of the first year, where you can see it says the Bolton and Paul hut has proved thoroughly satisfactory in every respect, and I would like to express my gratitude to that firm for supplying at short notice such an excellent building. For the second year of Operation Tabarin, they literally built upon the successes of the Bolton and Paul building at Port Lockroy. This time round, they actually had input into the design with Bolton and Paul, and they designed a building large enough to include the accommodation as well as all the science functions and other operations of the base. The building in the top left is that building, built at Hope Bay in 1945. Living in Antarctica in the harsh climate is difficult enough, as you can imagine. However, building a base down there can be even more fraught, with the extreme cold, the strong winds that you get down there, and the high accumulation of snow, as shown by the bottom right photograph, which was taken at Stonington Island in 1946. Again, built using a Bolton and Paul building, this hut was often buried up to the top of its roof in snow for weeks or months at a time. Bolton and Paul didn't just supply the main accommodation and science buildings on the bases, they often supplied a number of ancillary buildings, such as this one at the top, which is a balloon shed, which is at Faraday Station, which still stands today. That base is now run and managed by the Ukrainian Antarctic program, and it's called Vernadsky. The hut at the bottom was the first of the Halley buildings. All of the Bolton and Paul buildings, which were supplied to Operation Tabarin and to FIDS up until the mid-1950s, were what would be called traditional timber frame construction. They consisted of a large number of primary timbers, all fitting in a specific place within the structure, which were then overclad with timbers. These timbers that were the overclad were not cut in the factory, just the main structure as can be seen in this photograph from 1955. The cladding was cut on site. Before the building was dismantled, after construction in the workshop, each component was individually numbered and labelled. Then the building was dismantled, packaged, ready for dispatch to Antarctica. Whilst being a relatively well-known form of construction and cheap to actually construct, this type of construction does have a number of drawbacks. After the long, arduous sea voyage down to Antarctica, many of the timbers can be distorted, and so the mortise and tenons don't fit, and also many of the numbers have been lost. And once the construction has begun on site, finding an individual component can be difficult, especially amongst snowdrifts. These difficulties can lead to the construction being very slow. A good illustration of this being the construction of the Shackleton base for the Transantarctic expedition, where they tried to build the hut before the oncoming winter. However, the construction was slow and the team had to overwinter in their tents and a packing crate sent down that one of their snowcat tractors was in. So this form of construction can be seen to have a number of drawbacks. However, Bolton and Paul continues to use this type of construction for FIDS and Operation Tabarin through until the mid-1950s. These buildings, once in Antarctica, were usually constructed by scientists rather than builders or carpenters, and as a result, a number of discrepancies from the original plan were found, such as windows occasionally being fitted upside down and difficulties found. As a result, the quote at the bottom is from the base leader at Horseshoe Island in 1955, when they constructed their hut there, who said that the building of huts should not be considered a grim means to an end. The work of producing a really well-designed Antarctic hut should be considered experimental work in line with the general program of discovery, work comparable in importance with the various science studies. Clearly, Bolton and Paul listened to this feedback from FIDS, and in the mid-1950s they evolved their architecture and designs to incorporate panelised construction, initially just in timber and later on using steel portal frames and insulated panels. On the left here we can see the boat shed and store which was constructed at Port Lockroy. This building still stands to this day. It's a timber frame building that was built out of modular panels which are bolted together in situ, speeding up the process of construction. On the right is the generator shed at Port Lockroy, built a year later, this time incorporating steel portal frames, and this was overclad with insulated panels. Again, a much faster form of construction than previous. The middle building is a temporary hydrographic survey hut, which again was constructed at Port Lockroy, and the building stood for a couple of years before being dismantled and moved to the neighbouring island. This panelisation speeded up the construction process from months or weeks down to weeks or even days in some instances. At the start of my talk I mentioned the historic huts of the Ross Sea region, which I've worked on with the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust, and it seems that there is a possible connection with Bolton and Paul to these huts too. I have seen numerous internet sources stating that Bolton and Paul built the huts used on Scott's 1910 to 1913 expedition, during which he unfortunately perished on his return from the pole. However, I have not seen any official corroboration that Bolton and Paul were the constructors of these huts. Here you can see the main hut as built at Cape Evans during the expedition, but one hut, a small meteorological and research observatory, was never constructed in Antarctica, and it returned to New Zealand after the expedition, where it was subsequently built. There is a plaque associated with this building which states that Bolton and Paul did construct it. However, as I say, I have not seen any sources to corroborate that Bolton and Paul did build any of the huts associated with this expedition. However, if any of you know any different, I would be glad to hear from you and set the record straight as to whether Bolton and Paul did have an earlier connection with historic huts in Antarctica. I would now like to focus upon the work of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust to conserve the British historic sites on the Antarctic Peninsula. As I mentioned earlier, Operation Tabarin, FIDS and BAS constructed in excess of 30 bases in the region. By the mid-1990s, many of these bases were no longer operational, some had burnt down, but some were still operating, such as the site at Rothera, the main British Antarctic Survey base still operational today. In the mid-1990s, a survey was conducted to determine what the future of each of the remaining bases would be. Some were kept, such as Rothera, as I just mentioned. Some were no longer required and so were offered and passed to other nations, such as the British Antarctic Survey site at Faraday, which moved to the Ukrainian control and is now called Vernadsky. Some were deemed no longer required and were removed under the Antarctic Treaty's environmental protocols, and 6 of them were classified as historic sites and monuments, and it is these that are managed by the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. Of these 6 sites, 3 of them were prefabricated by Bolton and Paul. They are the ones that are highlighted by the red rectangles. The first one was Base A, Port Lockroy, constructed in 1944, and that was operational through to 1962. As we've seen, that base contains the original base building, prefabricated and obtained from naval stores in 1943. It also has the boat shed and store, which was constructed in the mid-1950s, and it also has the generator shed constructed in 1958. UKAHT now operate this as a manned base through the austral summers, having a team there which managed the living museum that we have there, as well as the Penguin Post Office I mentioned earlier. The second of the sites which was prefabricated by Bolton and Paul is that at Detai Island, the middle one of the three red rectangles. This was built in 1956 and was operational through to 1959, when it was abandoned in a hurry when the relief ship couldn't get to the site due to very thick sea ice, the team having to sledge 30 miles across the ice to get to the ship. When the base was closed in 1959, the personnel moved to the next site, the bottom of the three red rectangles, which is Horseshoe Island. This was built in 1955 using Bolton and Paul building and a separate, at that time, generator shed also by Bolton and Paul. The generator shed was subsequently attached to the main building and an extension built, again prefabricated by Bolton and Paul, and the base was closed in 1960. The UK Antarctic Heritage Trust operates a conservation team, and we are currently in the process of writing the conservation management plans and drafting implementation plans for future conservation works as to how the bases will be conserved for future generations. During the off-season, when I'm not actually in Antarctica working on or surveying the historic bases, I spend a significant period of my time conducting historic research. A fantastic source for information on these historic bases is the British Antarctic Survey Archive, which holds all of the original reports and diaries of the bases, as well as construction reports and survey reports, sledging reports, etc. Additionally, they also contain an extensive photographic archive, which has pictures of the bases through most of the years during which they were operational. We are also lucky in having a number of FIDS or ex-FIDS personnel still alive today, and they often are in contact with us to share their personal archives of information and recollections of operational life on the bases. I also have spent some time in the Norfolk Record Office archive looking at the Bolton and Paul archive, which has supplied many of the photographs used during this presentation. Here we have copies of some of the original base reports and diaries, as well as some plans drawn by the teams occupying the bases. Through studying these historical archives and references and documents, it's possible to establish the timeline of a building. And here we can see one classic example, which is the generator shed at Port Lockroy. We are phenomenally lucky in that we do have the original construction photographs from Bolton and Paul workshops, which were found at the Norfolk Record Office. And then you can directly compare this with the as constructed on-site photograph in the centre of the slide, which was supplied by David Price, who was one of the team, one of the FIDS who actually built the generator shed in January 1958. The British Antarctic Survey Archive also contains the report which was written by the team that constructed the generator shed, so we have a complete data set of how the base building was originally constructed. Through surveying the base building now, the photograph in the bottom right hand corner, which I took this last season, it is then possible to determine the changes which have been made to the building during its operational life, and also changes which have occurred which have not been referenced in historic reports and so were most likely conducted after the base was no longer operational. By tracking these changes, it is then possible for us to determine what the history of this building has been, and from this we can then come up with a management plan as to how the building should be conserved to best represent this history. Each season, the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust sends a conservation team down to Antarctica to work on the historic bases, whether this be surveying work, as we can see here in the photographs, looking for problems on the buildings which will need rectifying in the future, which enables us to plan the works and then purchase in the UK and then ship down the materials to work the following season. We aren't able to have the luxury of nipping out to the nearest hardware store to buy materials. We have to plan ahead and then ship these materials down to conduct the work. Another important part of our field seasons is to conduct emergency repairs to make the buildings weathertight. Here you can see the emergency store at Stonington Island, where a number of boards have been blown off the building due to the fixings being corroded. So it's important to keep out the snow, which can turn to ice and damage the buildings. Maintaining the buildings in a good weathertight condition is especially important, as allowing snow and ice to build up within the building causes a very damp environment within them, which can then cause the degradation of the many contained artefacts which represent the use of the base and the life of the people who occupied them. Here we're conducting some more extensive emergency repairs, such as shoring up walls which are starting to collapse, stabilising flues on the buildings because again they're starting to collapse due to rusting and degradation of the metals and substances that are attached to, and removing ice from within pup pens, which you can see a before and after photograph here. We have also been working very closely with the British Antarctic Survey Mapping and Geographic Information Centre, who have been conducting some photogrammetry surveys of the bases and using traditional photogrammetry as well as terrestrial laser scanning. By doing so, we're able to create these 3D computer models of the bases, which we can then use with our consultants who are not able to visit Antarctica, as well as engaging with the public. They also enable us to improve the interpretation of the buildings. Whilst constructed in the 1940s and 50s, these three Bolton and Paul buildings have now stood the test of time, probably in the world's harshest environment. They're now actively managed and maintained by the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust as examples of life on British Antarctic science bases of 70 years ago, and present a unique opportunity for the current and future generations to discover, understand and value Norwich's and Britain's Antarctic heritage. Finally, I'd like to say thank you for your time today, and if you would like to learn more about the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, please visit our website on www.ukaht.org, and if you'd like to support our conservation work, please consider becoming a member of the Trust. Now I shall leave you with Lewis Chippy Ashton, the carpenter who built Port Lockroy, the first Bolton and Paul building on the Antarctic Peninsula, which you can see in the photograph. Thank you.